Let's now catch up with Times columnist Daniel Finkelstein, who wrote earlier this week about his own family connection with Ukraine. Morning, Danny.
Good morning.
Your reaction, first of all, we discussed it on the show on, what was it, Tuesday? Feels like a long time ago now. You talked about going to Ukraine. That's where your family are from. Your father fled Ukraine.
Yes.
How does it feel this morning seeing what's playing out there now?
Well, it's heartbreaking and it's also very worrying because I've made a lot of friends there. I'm working on a book about my parents, and while I've been researching it, I've made a lot of friends, people with an interest in the history of Lviv, or Lvov, as my father called it. Because, in fact, although where he was born is now Ukraine, anybody who looks at a map will see that it's right on the border between Poland and Ukraine. And when my father was born there, he was actually Polish. That city was 50% Polish, 25% Ukrainian, 25% Jewish. That gives you an insight into the complicated ethnic history which Putin is trying to exploit and trying to confuse people about what's really at stake here, making them think that because this history is confused, there's therefore a Russian claim that we Westerners don't understand. Whereas President Zelensky of Ukraine correctly says this is about Ukraine's present and its future. And when I went there in October and talked to people, I could see that these were places that were trying to come to terms with their past. In Ukraine, in Lvov, there's, my grandmother was one of 7 children. She's the only one that survived the war. That partly was, fun enough, because she was sent to Siberia by Stalin. Her sisters and brothers were murdered by Hitler when he invaded. So it's got a very complicated history. But what they're trying to do is understand from that, recover from that, and become modern democracies. And that poses a danger to Vladimir Putin. It's why I think he's decided that he has to invade.
And how it's one of those things where in the past, Danny, it'd have been ridiculous to ask questions about, being drawn into a full-blown European war. But when you've got Vladimir Putin invading a sovereign nation, one that Britain and other countries have built up strong ties with, how bad do you think this could get?
Well, it's very bad. I thought the big difference, which we don't talk about, is obviously since the Second World War, we've got nuclear weapons, and the consequences of a European war are worse still than the consequences of the European war we entered into last time the Nazis and the Soviets invaded Poland. It makes what was in any case an incredibly difficult and consequential decision almost impossible to make, and so therefore, if it's something that can still be avoided, it has to be, simply because its consequences are so monstrous. And it does leave one feeling a bit helpless. I've seen lots of people, they kind of decide that perhaps this whole thing will be resolved by preventing somebody from giving a donation to the Tory party or something. This just massively underestimates what we're facing. Those things are not bad to do by themselves, by the way, partly because of the integrity of our own system, and partly because it may make a difference, and even a small difference is important to make. But it's a lot of it does seem to me like displacement activity, which I'm as guilty of as anyone else, because it's very difficult to decide what is to do for the best when someone effectively calls what has been a sort of Cold War period bluff, in which we don't see people invading independent countries. At the moment, the Soviet successor state, Russia, is sitting as the chairman of the UN Security Council. The very body that we set up in order to prevent precisely this sort of thing is being headed by the state that does it, and that shows what a profound shock this is to the settlement that we reached in 1945.
And I suppose it's one of these situations. I was talking to someone. We were talking about this earlier on in the show. The pandemic had a similar impact of things which had seemed up until now so completely unimaginable. The pandemic, and now war in Europe. That we spend
Matt, I'm
our
afraid I
time.
lost you there.
Danny, I think you're back. I was just explaining, we were talking about this a little earlier on the show, that actually we're going through such
Let me come out.
volatile times that, I think we might have lost Danny altogether. We can still hear him. He can't hear us. Oh, no, he is back. He's back. Danny, I was just saying that we're living in such volatile times, and you're right, the displacement activity of the small stuff, sweating the small stuff, if you like, the pandemic, completely turned literally the world on its head, and now war in Europe too, and we're sort of left wondering, countries like Britain where we think that, a bit more spending or put it on the credit card and we can solve all of life's problems. This is
Yes.
just feels unimaginable, and you're left feeling with a power sort of sense of powerlessness.
I think the truth is we're living in what I describe as the post-war era. We had a settlement after the war, which many of the contours of which we were familiar with. The importance of the Munich analogy, for example, the idea that we wouldn't let dictators dictate to us, the kind of increasing prosperity, the clash between communism and democracy in the West, even such things as the creation of the State of Israel after the Holocaust, and all of these things have now come into question. We are now in a post-war era. The contours of politics that we've understood it all of my adult life are being questioned. I think some of the principles we established are still good ones. And we ought to be moving towards an international system of law. My Lvivian cousin Philippe Sands is one of the sort of authors of that argument, and I think we had some disagreements over some of it, but I think he's basically correct. So I don't think we should allow this to throw ourselves completely from continued progress. Even in dealing with the pandemic, we showed the great progress we've made in the last 100 years scientifically. But certainly this is sort of sobering, the sort of lengthy period of peace that we've enjoyed, which we assumed would never come to an end. Well, it didn't always exist, and my parents didn't have that experience. And at my 50th birthday, Matt, which 10 years ago, unfortunately, I said to my guests, what happened to my parents has not happened to me, and I can't imagine it happening. And I wouldn't make the same speech on my 60th birthday. That is tragic.
Well, Danny, we're now awaiting Boris Johnson's statement to the nation in the next couple of minutes or so. What would you've written speeches before for prime ministers, you've advised them, party leaders and so on. What would you be saying to Boris Johnson this morning as to what he needs to do?
I think his speeches have actually been very good, and I would say that I personally think the emphasis that we should put should be on assisting Ukraine with its military response, as much as it is about trying to track down tangential figures whom people who don't like me, actually, basically, who don't really know what their links are, think sound Russian, and seeing whether we can freeze their assets. I'm all for doing that, but I think that unfortunately that even if we were right and those people were connected to Putin, he doesn't seem to be that bothered by it. But I think what will bother him is the internal damage. While we're talking about these assets, the stock market has fallen by 40% in Russia, and that doesn't seem to have deterred him. So I'm afraid, I think that we're in a war, and in that we have to adjust our sights in that way, and think how we can assist our allies in that war, which are Ukraine, to resist in the way that they can. But all along, we've got to have a kind of realistic view about how much. What our freedom of maneuver is in a circumstance in which our opponent has got nuclear weapons, and so have we. It's extremely worrying to be in that situation, and we have not been in that situation before. So, obviously that's very sobering. If I sound at this point as I'm petering out without a convincing final answer, that absolutely is exactly where I find myself. And I don't think the Prime Minister will be in that much of a different position. So we should expect clarity of objective. We should expect him to explain why we're in this for the future of world democracy. We should expect him to take some immediate action in terms of sanctions and in terms of finance, but we should also have some understanding that we're feeling our way a bit. I certainly am.
Danny, it's really good to speak to you. Daniel Finkelstein, thank you for your thoughts on that. It's Daniel Finkelstein, Times columnist.